Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. This is chapter 3 of Edward Feser's The Last Superstition with me and Dr. Michael Robillard. He is ex-Oxford, I am ex-Eton, and now we are doing our own thing, freed from the woke constraints of academia and higher education. This is a project that Dr. Robillard had in mind for a while. We're looking at some of the most important books that we feel outline neglected concepts in contemporary academia. We've covered the first two chapters already, and Dr. Robillard, what would you say are the most important concepts from the opening two chapters of this book?
I would say the point that Feser makes in the first chapter of this connection between atheism and sexual libertinism as being the almost foundational features of the classical liberal account of man and of the world, and that these things end up having a looping effect in uh, fueling one another. And this is essentially largely a result of seeing man as mechanism and removing final causality from man's nature and the world. And you can see that once that's removed, then you end up in this space of hedonism and sexual libertinism that uh, uh, takes out the foundations and leaves us in the civilizational collapse that we're presently in. Um,
And one of the things that collapses is rationality itself. I think one of Feser's most important points is that
yes, yes.
secularism undercuts the possibility of rationality.
Certainly, yeah, and I think that that's the other major point is that the once we do a deep dive into the atheist or materialist, atheist, naturalist commitments, we recognize that the intelligibility of basic things like mathematics or logic or moral claims or aesthetic claims, all of these things get lost. So that fundamentally, the atheist, materialist, naturalist worldview is it's fundamentally irrational and can't help itself to any of these resources that are or ideas that are foundational to the human condition.
Now, one of the things that we looked at in chapter 2 was the idea of Plato's forms and how something like that needs to be integrated into any coherent worldview for us to be able to talk about things like
Mhm.
concepts. What
Yeah.
is a Platonic form? What were the basics we covered last time?
So basics we talked about were something like the form of a triangle, the form of beauty, or the form of goodness, form of uh, mathematical entities, uh, and they instantiate in particular instances in the world. So I can look at four dogs or four apples or four wheels, but these are all participating more generally in the form of the number four that numerically we're noticing in the world. And it's like this for other forms as well, whether it's triangles or goodness or beauty. And this is the way in which it's this third world, it's this third realm by which humans and concept we can coordinate our language and our concepts so that we can have an intelligible conversation at all between other minds that we're referring to the same for when we're talking about these various instantiations of things.
Right.
So if
And so
one,
we can
yeah,
do science. So that we
yeah,
can do science at all.
at all, yes, yeah. So when I can look back to the writings of Newton, and I go, well, when he says 4 plus 4 equals 8, he's referring to the same propositions. He's referring, even though he's dead by several centuries before us, he's still what he scribbled on paper is still referring to the uh, same entity, uh, the number four. And if one can conceptualize that suddenly opens up a space where now we're talking about categories that aren't just material. It's not just bare mechanism, and this opens up the possibility to now talking about well what sustains any of that space at all.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting points you raised last time about God being the ground of the truth of all propositions. So 4 plus
Hmm.
4 equals 8 would be true in any possible universe,
Yes.
even if there'd been no human beings at all.
Yes.
And why is that necessarily true? And then we got onto the idea that ultimately truth is grounded in God, who is truth, capital T.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Yes. And that's the Feser ends this in chapter one, and that's the God that Aquinas and Aristotle are attempting to articulate, not the God in the gaps, cosmic man in the sky, takedown that the four atheists or the four horsemen are trying to straw man.
Yeah, that's a good segue into today's topic, which is how Aquinas refined and in some ways clarified
Hmm.
Aristotle's concepts. So it's a fusion of the best of Plato and Aristotle, ultimately, is what Thomism offers.
Hmm.
And before we get into today's new concepts, let's begin with our prayer. And people watching, please do follow along. Dr. Roblood, I did the prayer last week, so you lead us today, please.
All right, sounds good. Come, Holy Spirit, divine Creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom, pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect, dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. We've talked a bit in previous lessons about the idea that what many people think of as Christianity and classical theism more broadly
Hmm.
actually isn't what the most serious thinkers who argue for these ideas have put forward.
Hmm.
So you get ideas like, for example, God is a giant teapot orbiting the earth, or a
Right.
flying spaghetti monster,
Hmm. Hmm.
or believing in God is like believing in Thor, for example, or
Right.
any of the gods from the Greek pantheon.
Hmm.
We've mentioned previously that that fails to acknowledge that we're not talking about a being among beings, but being itself, capital B.
Yes.
And Feser begins chapter 3 by quoting a line from Michael Ruse, I think it was, wasn't it? Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
Saying to Dawkins, look, your book's bad and you're not willing to study Christianity seriously and to engage with the ideas. What explains this? Why is it that this whole field, natural theology, metaphysics more broadly, is written off as not being worthy of engagement?
It's a good question. It's I think a lot of them. I mean, other than Dennett, it's forgivable for the other three horsemen to an extent because they're not analytically trained in the way that Dennett is. So you could, I think you could somewhat forgive the other three for just not having the philosophical depth of knowledge to know what it is that they're actually talking about. So it might be a somewhat forgivable short-sightedness that they have. Dennett, on the other hand, I think is not forgivable in a similar way, and he still insists on collapsing Aquinas and uh, Aristotle and other theistic Leibniz into Paley's mechanistic view, essentially, and just straw manning, like everything's just a god in the gaps. Let's fill the gaps in of science with um, some type of contingent being to explain our shortfalls of what science has predicted so far. I think that's part of it. I think it's also getting back to what Faser has pointed out before is that a lot of these folks in their training, probably in undergrad, got a very truncated version
Mm.
of the five arguments for God, and then just moved on. So I think, yeah, a lot of it might just come down to the zeitgeist of 20th century analytic philosophy. It's moving on to whatever the next thing is, and isn't going back and looking at primary sources, or giving much of the traditional pre-classical liberal worldview any regard. It's just assumed that we're in a Popperian sense. We're just building upon and improving upon whatever the next thing is, and that's not always the case. Sometimes we can go wrong, terribly wrong, in fact.
I d This is true of even your grad school education in
Mhm.
philosophy, isn't it? It's not just undergrad. It happens after that too. The presentation of the ideas is in a way lacking integrity. You're not meeting them at their strongest.
Yeah, exactly. And I think everything, it's largely assuming that whatever the next best thing, whatever the cutting edge thing is just building upon uh, a I the a scaffolding that is always improving, the Whig interpretation of history, in a sense, and that presupposition is never itself questioned, and I think that is where at least Dennett finds himself, and the other folks, perhaps less so, but at least Dennett, I think, that's probably very much the history of his training.
So the assumption is that progress is automatic, newer
Mhm.
is better, we're more
Yeah.
sophisticated now than people who wrote centuries ago, merely from the fact that they wrote centuries ago. This sounds like the scientific attitude whereby we have made genuine discoveries in material terms. Our ability to manipulate nature has
Mhm.
bled over into other fields in a way that is unwarranted.
That is unwarranted, and therefore allows us to quickly skip over the foundational ideas, and that's already taken care of. Now we can jump into the stream of the dialogue within the last 50 years, maybe within the last 20 years, and everything else is just, it's settled. It's settled, uh, and we've moved beyond whatever the traditionalist uh, worldview was, and now we're on to whatever the next best thing. And I think that explains a lot of what's animating a lot of these folks' thinking, even though they themselves might not explicitly
Mm.
ever cognize that idea themselves.
It's a delusion, though, for them to think that they can do without metaphysics. As we've explained before, they
Yeah.
always end up doing it unconsciously and therefore badly, because there are all kind of metaphysical presuppositions that go into any form of science.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. This is the yeah, as we mentioned before, this is the failing of the logical positivists, and there's Feser quotes, I forget who it was, in there, talking about this need for metaphysics to it, it's constitutive of the entire project of science. So we're kidding ourselves thinking that we can get away from it, but somehow we keep making this error, or certain folks keep making this error.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this one in this chapter, but the delusion that final causes can be swept away
Mhm.
as
Mhm.
irrelevant, whereas really in biology, especially the discipline where they claim to have done away with them, they can't talk about hearts, brains, eyes, ears coherently without the idea of purposes.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
There's an irony there. Okay, now this is a phrase you mentioned just earlier, God of the gaps. And
Mhm.
if you talk to the average person who's had the kind of education in undergrad or grad school that you've just outlined, where the most serious theological ideas aren't presented at their strongest, Or if you talk to someone who's had no formal education at all, the idea in modern culture is that God is a bit like when medieval cartographers, when they were drawing their maps, if they weren't sure what was in an area, they just put dragon.
Mhm.
Here,
Right.
here
Yeah.
be dragons. Um, God is like that. It's just some mysterious creature who fills the areas that science has
Yeah.
to get explained.
Mhm. Yeah, it's this explanatory gap filler that will, as science and our base of empirical knowledge accrues, that will eventually crowd out the explanatory gap filler that we're putting in as God. But once again, this is just it's a grave category error, and we're not talking about empirical a god that is merely an empirical gap filler. Numbers aren't empirical, right? So right away, there's no weight to the number four. There's no smell or taste or sensory texture to the number four, or to the truth or falsity of certain propositions, or to minds, or to ethical claims, or to claims or propositions about beauty. So any of these, like if any of those things should uh, get people to see that being is more expansive and more multifaceted than just mere sensory data. Um, so we're not trying to merely come up with a lowercase g god to explain sensory data. There's just a difference in kind and in category that's going on here, and this is what the new atheists they're trying to mash God into this contingent spaghetti monster, God in the gaps, teapot conception.
And the bigger point is that you're right to say that all these kind of immaterial things like propositions are in principle not susceptible of scientific explanation. But even if every aspect of physical reality, for example, was explained in this empirical scientific way, the big question of why anything exists at all and why
Mm-hmm.
it is ordered in such a way that we can know it, why
Yes.
there are regularities of nature to be discovered, all
Yeah.
of these things science can't touch.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The fact that the world, that the world has intelligible regularities at all that we can do science upon uh, is not within the purview of scientific explanation.
So we're back to metaphysics again. The god
Yeah.
of the gaps uh, assumes something which we're not going to grant, which is that science could one day fill in all the gaps and there'd be
Hmm.
no need for God. He would be squeezed out. That's
Yeah.
a view that we don't agree with.
Correct.
Now, by contrast, Feser outlines how for Aquinas, reasoning to God is more akin to the kind of reasoning familiar from geometry and
Hmm.
mathematics in general. This is a big difference from the way that the new atheists would regard theological reasoning, because for them, unless you understand something scientifically, you're not understanding it at all. And they have a very, very narrow definition of what scientific understanding is allowed to be.
Hmm.
So this is a really foreign concept for people. You can get to God in the same way that you could get to what the nature of a triangle is, for example. It's not probability reasoning.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think this once again, this is once you start considering this realm of forms, this realm of propositions, this realm of mathematical entities, and you realize that those are not locatable in the empirical world, then that now becomes uh, reason to start asking, well, what explains or what grounds any of the truth of these entities, and the opening up of that space, it now means that the world is bigger than just empiricism, and it's bigger than just what we can do science on in a sensory or empirical sense. So I think that's the more proper starting. If you accept that as your starting point, then as Aquinas does, and as Plato and Aristotle do, then we can end up at the five proofs. But if our starting position is just everything is bare sense data, then and that numbers are somehow like collapsible or reducible to sense data or to materialism, then you're not going to your starting positions are just fundamentally wrong at that point, and you're going to have to keep sweeping all the metaphysical stuff under the rug as you make more and more adjustments to ignore that facet of reality.
And you mentioned starting positions there. I think it's worthwhile spending a bit of time on what the nature of the starting positions for this kind of reasoning are. Feser has a good comparison between different kinds of arguments. So he starts off making the point that these kind of arguments are akin to geometrical ones in being all or nothing. So once you accept the premises, if the logical reasoning is valid, then the conclusions follow necessarily. It's not a probabilistic hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And then the outline here goes like this. So a geometrical argument would start from a pure abstraction rather than an empirical premise. A scientific argument would start from empirical premises and draw merely probabilistic conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mathematical arguments start from purely conceptual premises and draw necessary conclusions. And then, this is the kind of argument we're looking at now, metaphysical arguments of the sort Aquinas is interested in combine elements of both these other forms of reasoning. They take obvious, though empirical, starting points and try to show that from these starting points, together with certain conceptual premises, certain metaphysical conclusions follow necessarily. So we've got, on the one hand, using our senses, looking at the world around us, we've got the empirical premises.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've also got, combined with those, conceptual premises of the kind that we've outlined in the previous two lessons.
Yes. Yeah. So the union of the a priori and the a posteriori, or the deductive and inductive, is the synthesis that Aquinas is going after, and that I think speaks most correctly to the human condition. You know, we operate in understanding categories, but we also operate in understanding sense data and probability and inductive reasoning as well. So a proper or a comprehensive account of reality is going to attend to both of these spheres of being.
Yeah, I think it's a harmonious and integrated way of accounting for how the human intellect actually works. Aquinas
Mm-hmm.
has that great line that there's nothing in the intellect which wasn't first in the senses.
Yeah.
We abstract from sense data. And what you get with empiricism and rationalism is a bit like a pincer movement. And the two things together help us
Mm-hmm.
to grasp reality and get a hold on it. And what we're seeing with scientism, at least as Feser presents it, is that pure empiricism, discarding rationalism, ends up, unsurprisingly, being irrational. You can't account for fundamental features of the world or our ability to make sense of it.
Yes. Yes. It results in a discarding of entire areas of our experience in the world and what we can conceptualize, and then it often requires a smuggling back in of metaphysical claims, nonetheless, that they're going to at face value say that they're not making.
There's a, just from memory, there's a, it's a dogma of the Catholic Church, I think it's phrased like this, um, that the existence of God can be proven with certainty. And some people balk at that claim. Certainty, really?
Mm.
What, so beyond possible doubt for anyone ever? And could you say a bit more about this idea of it being an all or nothing form of reasoning? Maybe that helps to explain what it means to be able to prove the existence of God with certainty as a dogma.
Let's see. I think a lot of it goes back to just the argument from necessity, where if we go back to an account of contingent claims and necessary claims, then at some point your any type of reasoning is going to bottom out in a God as being necessary, and that is I can't think of a more what's the word I'm looking for, more exhaustive account of what would count as a proof. So in that sense, then that would be my understanding of uh, God's provability in that sense.
Yeah, you people can dispute the premises, but once the premises are accepted, the conclusions follow necessarily. And these are the kind of premises whereby if you do dispute them, all kinds of absurdities come in very quickly. And the alternative to accepting the idea of the necessary proof is, as we've talked about previously, that rationality itself ends up going out of the window.
Rationality ends up going out the window, and then oftentimes the folks that are offering alternative or counter arguments are helping themselves oftentimes to the conceptual explanatory apparatus that the theist is positing without knowing it. So that's the other sort of element that's going on, where they have to presume things like mathematics,
Mm.
that the regularities about the universe, that there are other minds, that there is an empirical world at all. These things are just imported in as counter arguments against theism. But it's like that you actually require a ground of being to get those things off the ground to begin with.
Yeah, but they don't want to acknowledge what those things really entail, because otherwise you can reason your
Mhm.
way from the premises those depend on to where the theists are going anyway, where the atheists don't want to go to.
Well, I think that right there, that gets to the small but major gap between, as you said, Copplestone versus Russell,
Mm.
where Russell's willing to go all the way down to say everything's just this bare substratum of contingent brute categories, but nothing underneath that. And Cobblestone's willing to go one level further, and you can see the radical departure from where they both ended up.
Yeah, that's it. Ironically, I think it's the metaphysical mindset that is the more deeply probing and searching of the two, the more scientific in the true sense of the
Mhm.
world,
Yes.
as
Yep.
being interested in knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Now, we've mentioned logical positivism, and you've explained how it is ultimately self-refuting because it can't satisfy its own criteria.
Mhm.
And Feser says how when you read some of the atheist accounts of the, I suppose, cheapened classical theistic arguments, you see in their attempts to refute them as they see it, they actually just demonstrate all kinds of misconceptions.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
he makes the remark that the positive mind has failed to school itself in careful metaphysical thinking. This is partly because the idea that to understand something is to understand it scientifically, and that means to understand it in terms of numbers and empiricism and what can be measured is so common.
Mhm.
But it's also because of metaphysics being seen as somehow pointless. We saw Sam Harris recently talking about where's heaven. I looked up with a telescope, I couldn't see
Yeah.
it. That's a kind of
Yeah.
clear example. What,
Yeah.
yeah, what did you find in your grad studies and just talking to people generally, what are some of the clearest ways this failure manifests itself?
I think that in my grad school studies, it really, as I look at the anthropology of grad school and kind of where I was, it it took the form of hyper specialization. So where folks would within a certain context, they're like, oh, I'm working on philosophy of mind, or I'm working on ethics, or I'm working on political science. But it was as if there's nothing binding or grounding any of these things in a coherent way. Um, so that it would set up situations like a Harris type psyche, where at one moment one would be saying, well, maybe we have no free will, there are no minds, there's no God or being or metaphysical truths, and then the next moment they're uh, apoplectic over something that Trump said or the MAGA people said, and is it, we need to stop this outrage, and so now we're switching hats, and now we're ethicists all of a sudden, and I think that is very um, pervasive within grad school, is the siloing of disciplines and siloing of subfields of philosophy without any regard for how they're mutually informing one another. But it's like if you you look at things, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, uh, they do overlap and interrelate uh, in all these fields, but most folks don't want to recognize it. Um,
Well, let's take an example of that with political philosophy. A lot of people nowadays are interested in politics because there are so many hot topics in the news
mhm,
about it. People get into philosophy often via
right.
politics nowadays.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
the world has become, I think, because of that, more intensely philosophical than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
People have been woken up in a way to philosophical concepts by the transgenderism debate, for
Yep.
example.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
is a woman is a philosophical question that 20, 30 years ago, people probably weren't thinking about in the same way they are now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Certainly.
political philosophy is a branch of moral philosophy.
Hmm.
So you can't tell what the right kind of political organization for human beings is unless you think about what is good for human beings. And then
Yep.
you're into questions about the metaphysical status of what man is, what is
Yeah.
good for us objectively,
Hmm.
if anything.
Yeah. Certainly. Yeah. So I think this acknowledgement of this deep intertwining between epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, between fact and value, between politics and philosophy of language, that all these things are deeply interconnected, uh, is something that is I don't know that we need to get back to, and it's something that Harris and company don't want to fully acknowledge. So it's like when they have their atheist hat on, now they're hardcore determinists. Then they take it off, and now they're political commentators and they're ethicists, and it's that combination of uh, there's sort of a meta incoherence between doing that, and then also probably a fair bit of intellectual dishonesty occurring as well. So I think to point that out is helpful in bringing us back to a more comprehensive and rightly ordered account of philosophy.
Yeah, I like the idea of the intertwining being important, which brings us back to that idea of empiricism, rationalism intertwined in the way that Aquinas is approaching
Mhm.
things. So it's
Yep.
a more holistic philosophy right from the start. You mentioned meta incoherence there. What do you mean by that?
If I'm playing the game of I'm just going to pretend I'm talking about atheist determinism, and I go ahead with those claims, and I said there are no minds, there's no free will, there's no good, there's no evil. We're just bare meat machines, just running some sort of evolutionary process. Then, if those claims are held to be true, I can't then coherently start making claims about, well, we ought to choose to decide policy A versus policy B with respect to foreign policy. That is now helping itself to all sorts of claims about minds, about free will, of there being a good or a bad, or a right or a wrong. So it's that if one looks at both of those claims being sustained at the same time, those are fundamentally incoherent. If looked at in isolation, then I guess you can get away with it. But if it's the same person saying it, then there needs to be an account of how those things gel. And Harris and Company usually, I don't know what their move is. Probably just to change the subject.
They don't gel it; they just gloss over it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
on the
yeah,
one hand, write books about how there's no free will. On the other hand, how homophobia, for example, is terrible, and how feminism is really
yeah,
good. And
yeah.
there's this language coming in, all these concepts, as you say, which aren't grounded in what their explicit worldview is at all.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Harris he tries to do this in his second book, The Moral Landscape, and these robust metaphysical oughts or moral oughts are just supposed to bubble up out of bare neuroscience, because of something about the bare facts of the deterministic neuroscience are supposed to give us thick normativity that somehow looks like 21st century 21st century ethics. Like that's just the that who knew that's what came out of just the bare matter. And you see other versions of this, but it's most philosophers recognize it as a failed project.
Got a question. Is Feser being a bit unfair to the new atheists' motivations in that they are actually just continuing in the tradition of the Reformation, expelling popery, banishing superstition, enforcing purity, etc., as in Tom Holland's Dominion argument? Do you want to take that one first? I've got a couple of ideas about it. So the new
I
atheists continue the tradition of the Reformation, trying to banish superstition.
I I took at least what Luther was attempting to do was to be calling out features of the church that he was giving it a fair appraisal. Like I don't know if he was strawmanning what the church was doing. Yeah, 'cause, I mean, there was a counter Reformation. There were responses to maybe some of the excesses of what the church wasn't living up to. The four horsemen, I don't like I said, I think that the other three might get off the hook a bit, but Dennett especially, I don't think are approaching the theistic arguments in good faith in the way that Luther might have been, even though he was wrong and mistaken. So I think that there might have been the degree of sincerity with which is going on here. It might be somewhat of a difference. And the Dominion book, I'm not familiar with.
Well, I think you've nailed it in that answer. For me, a good example of Feser's problem with how the new atheists approach Aquinas and co. He mentions how Dennett dismisses the cosmological argument, the central argument in the history of philosophical theology, with one
One
paragraph.
paragraph, yeah.
And he spends most of that paragraph on what Feser calls the stupid everything has a cause, so what caused God caricature that none of
Yeah,
those thinkers ever actually defended.
yeah.
So I think you're right there in that they either haven't done their homework or perhaps even worse, um, aren't even interested in it, don't regard it as work. It's like a student who's just said, maths is boring, I'm not going to do it.
Yes. Yeah. 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 I think so.
Now, actually, that point brings us onto our next concept nicely. God is necessary as an uncaused cause of the universe, even if we assume that the universe has always existed and thus has no beginning. Now, this one I remember reading for the first time in Aquinas, and it was really mind blowing that, let's say, the Big Bang hadn't been agreed as the current best theory of the origins of the universe. There were lots of people within the scientific community who didn't want the Big Bang to be established as the origins theory because to them it looked too much like a beginning, and a beginning sounded too much like what you get in
Hmm.
Genesis. So it was
Hmm.
unpopular as it was emerging. And had it not been agreed upon, you would have had atheists saying, oh, the universe never had a beginning.
Hmm. Hmm.
Therefore, it wasn't created. Therefore, there's no need for God. But what Feser outlines in Aquinas' thinking is that actually, even with an eternal universe that always
Hmm.
existed,
Hmm.
you still need God. How
Yep.
can people get their heads around this idea? I found it really hard to grasp the first time.
I would say that yeah, same as well. The I'd say for me it was a recognition of not thinking of causality merely in terms of a linear sequence in time and space, but causality as as a uh, moment by moment sustaining of everything. So even if you had like an infinite series going all the way back, there would still need to be a being that sustains that, uh, and that would not be part of that series in any sense. Even if it was an infinite regress going all the way back, it's the grounds for the series to exist at all. A necessary being sustaining the infinite causal chain.
Let's get some pictures to help make those concepts clear because that's exactly it. That's the distinction. So let's have, on the one hand, a line of dominoes stretching back millions of years, and then we've got that first domino flicked, and then
Hmm.
the rest sequentially in time causality get knocked down one by one.
Yep.
That's one way of thinking about cause and effect,
Hmm.
but we're not thinking in that kind of way in this example, are we?
Right. Right. We're talking about the table that the dominoes are on, so to speak. That's the what's holding them up and at all. And you can also talk about what's holding up existence. The existence of the dominoes, the existence of the table, the existence of any temporal causal sequence at all. So it's yeah, it's a capital B being that we're trying to articulate, and it hits a point, and I mean this is where I think I share some uh, sympathies towards the mystics, where language does give out at a certain point. Concepts do give out, and we're pointing at what that grounded being is with language, but it's not the same thing.
So the idea here then, using Faye's example of the kid playing with a hoop with a stick, is that the second that the boy stops applying the stick to the hoop, the game's over. If the
Hmm. Hmm.
hand's not holding the stick and that isn't pushing the hoop, then
Yep.
that chain of causality falls apart. It's not
Hmm.
like an event long ago in the past with the domino started something off that just carries
Yep.
on bit by bit. It's
Yep.
Causality that, if we think of it, goes down rather than
Hmm. Hmm.
back.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we need to combine, as we were looking at earlier with the nature of this kind of reasoning, some empirical ideas, things we can
Hmm.
see around us.
Hmm.
So the fact of change in the world we see, contingency, and that
Yep.
things didn't have to be. So if you look out in your garden, there might be a tree there in one position, but not necessarily so. The
Hmm.
reality around us is all contingent in some way.
Yep.
And we've got change, contingency, and we reason our way from those things, thinking about the four causes we looked at in the previous lessons, to
Hmm.
some kind of unmoved mover.
Yes.
And this isn't the God of Christianity yet, but this is the God of Aristotle and classical theism. And
Hmm.
Feser
Yep.
said that the unmoved mover is ultimately the first cause, and we
Hmm.
can say some things about what this must be because of the idea of pure actuality.
Hmm.
So this is where I think the most difficult philosophical concepts come in. Uh, People thinking about how you get from the example of a boy who's playing with a stick and a hoop, and if he stops playing, the whole game stops.
Hmm.
Thinking about the world, if God stops creating it right now, you, me, everyone watching, the computers, it all just blinks out of existence.
Yes.
That's the kind of creating we're talking about, isn't it?
We're talking about that. We're also talking about future contingent claims and past claims as well. So the facts of things happening in the past are being sustained being by a grand mind as well, where it's even if there were no humans, if we were blinked out of existence right now, that 2 plus 2 is eternally always 4 and always will be, is still held, sustained in existence by God, by being, by a grand mind.
So the gradations that Feser outlines then for the way people think about God, I think it's worthwhile going through those because you can really see how most discussions actually never get past the lowest level. I think
Mm.
disappointingly. So number
Yep.
one, Feser says God's like an old man with a white beard, a stern kind of wizard who has human thoughts, human motivations, and lives very far away. Think of this as being a bit like Zeus, for example.
Hmm.
Next level up, which I think you get to in most kind of um, A level, so college level philosophy courses, undergrad courses, uh, God doesn't really have a bodily form, and his thoughts and motivations are different from ours. He's an immaterial object or substance that has existed forever and maybe pervades all space. He made the world like a carpenter builds a house. And
Hmm.
then we get to the next level up, which I think is what we're trying to outline here, summarizing some of
Hmm.
the ideas in the chapter, which is that God is not an object alongside other objects or a substance alongside other
Hmm.
substances in the
Hmm.
world. So, this is why you keep saying being with the capital B,
Yeah.
totally distinct from time, space, all things that exist, and actually underlying them in being at every moment. If he stopped creating the world, it would all cease to exist right now.
Hmm.
So it wasn't started a long time ago and then left to run like a clockwork machine. Feser has the analogy of it's like a musician playing music. The
Yeah.
second the musician stops playing, the music stops, and the whole world is a bit like music in that sense.
Hmm. Yes. To include mathematical entities as well. Like that's part of the world being sung or played into existence.
And then the level up from that, uh, Feser says it's like Aquinas's mystical experience, and after which he famously said everything he'd written was like straw, and then
Mm.
refused to write any more theology.
Yeah.
And then level 5, the last one, God as Aquinas knows him now, in the beatific vision of the blessed after death. So, thinking about the 5 levels, I think it's fair to say that given the flying spaghetti monster arguments and the flying teapot arguments, most popular philosophy discussions take place around level 1, maybe creeping into level 2 in some ways.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I would say so. And that is, yeah, what various versions of it that the Dennett and Harris and company are offering. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this yet in the podcast, but like it should be noted that the the new atheists didn't have any new atheist arguments. They they're just rehashing these takedowns of Paley's mechanistic clockwork argument, or like you said, like some sort of counter argument against one or two, but we're not at but not addressing number three here.
Not only did they not have any new arguments, I wonder whether it's also fair to say that they didn't even really have any new ways of getting the foundational arguments wrong. It seems like just the same misconceptions.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I have to check that, but I can't think of any ways in which even their objections are novel. They don't put forward any new arguments for atheism, and I don't think they have any new refutations of the theistic arguments either.
Well, yeah, Feser I think says something that he said that Dawkins especially seems to be stuck not in 1960 but in 1860, and he's rehashing like some T.H. Huxley shtick, and yeah, that wouldn't surprise me if they're not even original in what they're getting mistaken, right? They're not even original in that regard. They can at least make original mistakes. You know, that would be interesting.
uh, this is the bit that I found hardest in this chapter. Um, Feser explains this concept that the essence of everything within the universe is distinct from its
Mm.
existence. Now, what does this mean?
So I can have the essence of something is its fundamental nature, but its existence is the way in which its essence is instantiated or actualized in the world. So the essence of I can have the essence of Pegasus, for instance, but there is no existence of Pegasus in the
Mm.
world. I have the essence of a unicorn, but there's no existence of a unicorn. Um, I get the essence of man, but he's only it exists in the form of uh, George Bush, but not in the form of Bruce Wayne. So that those analogies at least kind of get us a bit of a distinct conceptual distinction between the not all essence and not all essence is um, necessitates existence.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, isn't it? So there's nothing in the nature of the essence of a frog, say, or a human being or a bear that means it must exist. It might not have existed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Now, how do we get from this distinction then between essence and existence to God? Why is it philosophically relevant? Because we can look around in the world and see all kinds of things that might not have existed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can look around and we see all sorts of things that might not have existed, but essence is um, it's a necessary precondition for the actualization of any type of existence. So this starts taking us back, not so much as I feel like it's another angle almost to get to the idea of uh, not necessarily an unmoved mover, but like an uh, unactualized actualizer or necessary being. Uh, a ground of essence that gives the preconditions for existence.
So this is relevant. Feser points out to Aristotle's differentiation between actuality and potentiality. So the passage in question is: remember that the ordinary objects of our experience, people, dogs, cats, trees, rocks, are in Aristotle's view composites of form and matter, where the
Mhm.
form is the essence or nature of the thing, and the matter is what has taken on that form, nature or essence. So, for example, there is the form or essence of a human being, being a rational animal, and there is the matter that makes up the human body, which has this form or essence. Now, relative to matter, the form or essence is actuality. It actualizes the potential in the matter, in this case, making it a living human body rather than a cat or an apple. So, existence or being is what actualizes a form or essence. That's the
Mhm.
link between Aquinas talking about the distinction between essence and existence, and Aristotle with actuality and potentiality.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, both these ideas are really crucial to getting to the idea of the unmoved mover, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, they are. Yeah, like I said, I feel like that they're both two different angles that point towards that that foundation.
So, tell me a bit more about the principle of causality or the principle of sufficient reason. Then, so when we're thinking about the fact that these things do exist but needn't have existed,
Mhm.
why is this principle of sufficient reason relevant?
Well, we need to find an appropriate explanation that grounds uh, these contingent beings that we witness and that we apprehend conceptually and empirically. So the explanatory reason for that, we need to start backing up to find our foundations, and it seems like explanatorily the we end up getting back to some necessary being as the grounds for for any of it. Uh, that I mean that to my mind, I think is the shortest, most succinct way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's it. So Feser puts it as what does not have existence on its own must have a cause. And then you're back to the point you made about the necessary being from that line of reasoning.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered most of the dense philosophical concepts in this chapter. There'll be more to talk about next lesson, but you've done a really great job of outlining some of that material for us. It's a strange territory for people to come into for the first time, having spent most of their education on level one of thinking about God as a caricature of an old man with a white beard.
Yeah, yeah, as some type of silly contingent cause amongst every other contingent cause. Yeah.
That's it, exactly. So we need to next time think a bit about what the kind of characteristics of this first cause might be,
Mhm.
how we get to the idea of intelligence from that. What do we know about the necessary being?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that I guess will be the latter end of chapter three of the third argument that we haven't got to of
Yeah,
what.
that's it.
Yeah.
So for next week, people can recap on the end of chapter three, and we'll use that as a bridge into chapter four for the discussion next time.
Mhm.
All right.
Sounds
Thank you
good.
very much. Great answers.
Awesome. Cool.
Take care.
Thanks
See you
everybody.
next week.
Later.